Okay, good morning. Today is October 14th, and today I wanted to talk about the home sale contingency 22B and just what happens after an offer comes in. So in order to start this conversation, I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about the differences between Form 22Q versus 22B. 22Q is called the buyer's pending sale, and 22B is a contingent sale. So what's the difference between those? Well, a 22Q should only be used when a buyer's property has already got under contract and they have an established closing date. With this in place, the contract is technically pending, and that pending contract cannot be bumped out of position. If another buyer should show interest, that buyer can hold second buyer position, but not have a bumping opportunity. With a 22B, that means that the buyer has to sell property in order to purchase the new one. The buyer may have not yet listed their home, or they may have listed it. The buyer does, or if they have a home, they have not come to a mutually accepted offer on that home. And during that process of which they're waiting for that mutually accepted offer, that buyer can be bumped until that contingency is either waived or satisfied. With the Form 22B, this is only the home sale contingency. So all other contingencies can still exist in addition to that 22B and be included in the purchase and sale agreement if the buyer expects to have those protections. So in other words, this contingency is only there to protect the buyer if their property they're selling fails to close. We'll talk about some of the details on that in a minute. A seller can bump an offer that uses a 22B anytime before that contingency is deemed satisfied. Now, the offer that they use to bump it can also be contingent. So if you're finding yourself in that time, make sure you're doing everything you can to properly sell that home. And they can enact by the end of the contingency. If they have any inaction at the end of the contingency, it's going to result in an automatic termination. It basically times out and says, all right, everybody tried their hardest, but this contract has now ended. Now, if you have financing protection for the buyer with a financing contingency, you can add that in as well. There is a financing provision in 22B, but the financing contingency does break down more of that protection for the contingency rather than the action of applying for financing. And then lastly, no matter how many stacked contingency buyers there are, you could have a contingent offer that has accepted a contingent and another contingent on top of that. The timeline only begins when the last one has a mutually accepted, non-contingent, actual closing date to then line up the rest of those consecutive closing dates. And we want to make sure that all of that timeline matches up within our contingency period. So there's a lot going on here. I just want to go over some really quick ways of how we can fill out the 22B. So this right here is from 22B. The first paragraph is the contingent offer or the contingent sale of the buyer's property. For this, you're going to need to know the address of the property that needs to be sold in order to purchase the new property. This contingency form can only be for one property. So if the buyer has multiple properties they need to sell in order to purchase this one, you may not put them on one page. You can't stack them. One of them is going to have to be the deciding factor in order to use this contingency properly. If you find yourself having multiple properties that need to be sold, I would highly suggest using a completely different form in order to work that transaction. So paragraph 1, you're going to put the property address of the home that needs to be listed and sold before this purchase can happen. The on or before the date. That is the amount of time that the buyer has to get that home under contract. That's the amount of time that this 22B contingency will have until it expires. Now, the important thing and most important thing is not to break the rules that go along with this contingency. Rule number 1, the buyer has to list their property. It says the buyer shall list their property for their sale on the multiple listing service in an area that the buyer's property is licensed with the real estate firm and after mutual acceptance of this agreement. So we have 5 days by default to have this property listed on the Northwest MLS after this entire purchase and sale agreement has been accepted. The consequence of not doing so lies in line number 12. It says, if the buyer fails to do so, this contingency and all other conditions in this agreement, including everything you can possibly think of, including financing, inspection, every single thing you can think of in that contract to protect that buyer goes away. And the contingency for selling their home on 22B shall be deemed completely waived. And now we'll have an established closing date that is 30 days from the day this rule was broken. This is the largest and most detrimental consequence that a buyer can face in pretty much any of our contracts. So if you are doing a contingent sale, please make sure that you are in fact listing that home on the Northwest MLS. Remember, it only takes one exterior photo, your listing paperwork, and your listing agreement to actually comply with this rule. Now, the second rule is the property being sold, right? So if the buyer has not sold the property within this time listed above here, there is a protection for that buyer that says, buyer, if you did everything you said you did and you still can't sell your house, the protection of your contingency and your earnest money is going to stay intact. For the purpose of this conversation and for the purpose of this agreement, the word selling is going to be getting something mutually under contract. And if something should sell, we need to make sure that we are properly giving notice to that seller or the buyer, whoever is, in communication needs to give notice to the other party. Then there are forms that we have specifically in place to do that communication. So think about this for a second. I am contingent on purchasing with a 22B in place. My client's home has been on the market for under 3 weeks and is still active. My client wants to pull out of the deal altogether and get the $7,000 earnest money back. Can the client do this? Well, if the client put into place that they were going to allow that home to sit on the market and actively try to sell it for a specific amount of time, then no. The buyer who has become a seller is not able to just pull it off the market and change their mind. So unless the seller agrees to terminate the purchase and sale agreement, then the contingent buyer does not have a right based on the facts that were just there. And based on the facts between this and this scenario, the buyer has to keep their property on the market for that required length of time. And if during that time it doesn't sell, then the buyer can go ahead and give notice that it didn't sell. The second part of our contingency is when is a seller required to give consent for an offer to be accepted? So that seller is taking their home off the market for this buyer who is in good faith going to try to do everything they can to sell their house just so they can buy this seller's house. Well, that buyer who's taken that seller's home off the market has a few rules they need to follow. If they go outside of that parameter, then they do need the seller's permission to do so, because that would be something that was kind of a realistic sort of, good faith, right? So buyer cannot come in and just accept another contingent offer without that seller's permission, or if that buyer is going to have a lengthy closing time or even a very, very, very short closing time, they also need permission from the seller. This is because we need to be able to do enough communication so that seller can prepare to close early, or that the seller consents to closing late. With these, there are proper notification forms that need to be done, and luckily our contingency form lists out exactly those forms. If you need to get consent, there's a form called the 90L, which I'll go through in a different sort of sit down. I'm not going to be going through that today. Now, if the buyer does accept one of those offers that they did need permission from without getting permission, and the seller, as soon as the seller finds out, the seller does have 3 days to kind of take a step back and decide if this is going to be a make it or break it point in this contract. They cannot sit on this information forever and just hang on to this. But if within those 3 days, that seller decides the offer that you've chosen to accept is something that I just can't, work with you on, then that seller does have the right to terminate this entire contract. And unfortunately for that buyer, keep the buyer's earnest money because they did go outside of what they were allowed to do without that seller's permission. Now, the buyer still has to apply for a loan if they are using financing. So the loan application provision is still in the 22B as well. This one is so you can decide if that loan application is going to be made 5 days after the mutual acceptance of this entire contract, or if that's going to occur within 5 days of getting the buyer's home sold. As sellers, you may opt for at least knowing if that buyer is qualified to buy your home by having it within the first 5 days of your contract. This is going to be something that's just a conversation between the parties that are involved. No real right or wrong answer, but knowing the timelines of how they start is quite important. The first option is 5 days after mutual acceptance of the contract, including 22B. And the second one is 5 days after that 22B sale has a mutually accepted offer. So those timelines can be stretched very far apart. And keep in mind, in those times, interest rates could change, buyer situations may change, their approval completely may change. So thinking about that, a buyer is under contract to purchase a property with a 22A financing contingency and a 22B home sale contingency. The contingency property did not sell within the timeframe specified on 22B, so the buyer is terminating. On the 22B, that timeline for the buyer to apply for application began after the mutual acceptance, 5 days after the mutual acceptance to make loan application. If a buyer failed to make loan application within the 5 days of mutual acceptance, did the buyer also waive the 22B home sale contingency? So we need to kind of separate this and think about this. We have a home sale contingency that says, I need to sell my home. I'm going to do everything I can. And if I can't do it within my time specified, then I'm going to be protected with this contingency. And then we have a separate idea saying, oh, and by the way, I'm going to be applying for financing. And if I can't get approved for financing, I'm also going to be protected for not being able to purchase this home. So what happens if the financing is either denied or if it is not followed through with the correct method? Well, in this situation, the 22B home sale contingency is completely separate from the financing contingency. The only thing that really wraps them all together is the waiver of all contingencies. So we need to kind of take our minds away from these being one contingency and put them into their own categories. In this specific situation, the home sale contingency and the financing were separate, unrelated, and each one had its own protections based on the rules that applied. So the waiver of a financing does not necessarily do anything to the home sale contingency part. If they were denied for financing, what they would have to do is show that they were denied for financing in a way that they would had the 22B not been in place. And they can still do what they can to try to sell that home within that 22B timeline for that contingency. So they are not necessarily grouped together in that manner. Now, in order to do this and to be in good faith, that buyer needs to keep their home on the market and continually try to sell the home until the end of that contingency period. That being said, as soon as there is an offer that comes in, we do have a timeline to where that buyer does have notice, where they can make a decision where they can either, waive the contingency protection of trying to sell their home, or just say, we're doing everything we can and we just can't make this work. That is called a bump notice, and it's a bump notice period. So it defaults to 5 days. And as we know, based on our computation of time, 5 days actually turns into 1 week. So what this paragraph in number 4 is saying is that if a genuine offer comes in that seller wants to take and bump that first buyer out of the way, then that seller needs to give that buyer notice, and that buyer has a week to either try to get their home under contract, waive the contingency, or just say, hey, it's not going to work out. That timeline can actually stretch very, very far. So keep in mind these days when you're filling out this, if you're leaving these with boilerplate days, This is actually a week, which is a very extended conversation on this. Again, any notices that you give have been bullet pointed with the 22B as far as which forms need to be used in order to give those notices. So make sure we're using the correct forms. All right, think about this question. The buyer listed their home within the 5 days, but did not get an offer within their 45 days. So let's just say that these are the boilerplate days that they chose. They chose to put their home on the market within the 5, they complied. They chose to sell their home within 45 days, they complied. However, no offers came in. The buyer then asked for a 30-day extension to try to sell their home, which the sellers granted. Now, if we think about this as the big picture, they have 75 days to get their home under contract instead of the 45 days. Now, about 5 days after granting that extension, the buyers pulled their home off the market and they want to go back out and they want to back out of the offer. Who would get the earnest money in this situation? What is happening here? So this is a buyer getting cold feet. The buyer had an extension, and in that extension, the buyer had an obligation to give good faith efforts to try to sell their home. So in this situation, the buyer was actually required to list their home on the market, list it for sale, and continue to try to sell it within the whole contingency period. And from this the minimal facts presented, this buyer would be in breach of contract if this is how it played out. Now let's talk about that contingency being satisfied. We have our timeline that we had to put it under contract. And at the end of that time, we need to figure out if we are going to satisfy this contingency or if we're just going to use that protection because nothing happened. So how do you know if you've satisfied the contingency versus waiving the contingency? How do you know what to do? If an offer comes in, are you satisfying it or are you waiving it? What should we do? So if you have a home that you've gotten under contract and you've done that within your 22B timeline, you have satisfied the requirement to sell the home. If you have not got the home under contract, then you do not have anything to kind of lean back on with this contingency period. However, you've done everything you should have in order to try that. So you have not waived the contingency, but rather you've exhausted it. You've done everything you could, you've exhausted the timeline, and it is there now to protect you for doing everything that you should have done. A waiver of the contingency means you are removing all protections that contingency did offer you. There are a few ways that we can get this contingency waived, but most likely we are going to see that it's being satisfied. When you are satisfying the contingency and an offer comes in, and that's what you're presenting to that seller saying, hey, I've done everything I can. I sold my house now. This contingency is satisfied. Remember that we have to attach a complete copy of that purchase and sale agreement when we show that that contingency is being satisfied. And why do we have to do that? Well, we have to do that because if the buyer had accepted an offer that was not acceptable from the seller at least needs to be on notice and see that what they've done. That offer that was accepted directly affects the closing date of the offer in place with 22B. Everybody needs to be in communication with this. So you're going to find that anytime a notice is being given by a buyer, especially when it involves another sale that affects directly this sale, you're going to need to require that buyer to attach the entire offer that's been accepted on the other sale. Now, there are a few consequences when it comes to the timing of our 22B. If we can think about this in a big picture of 45 days, the entire contingency is there for that full 45 days. So what happens at the end of that? What happens if by the end, the property doesn't sell? Well, we all know that protection is in place for the buyer. It is of no fault of the buyer. And that would be option B right here, is if the sale terminates and fails to close, the sale terminates if the sale of the buyer's property fails to close through no fault of the buyer during that contingency property, then it's going to be refunded to buyer. Now, these consequences are really pointed out for if the buyer does get their home under contract within that 45 days. What happens if they get their home under contract on day 10? Well, they still have 35 more days to make sure that that property can close. Excuse me. If on day 15, the buyer for that property says, you know what, never mind, I'm backing out of this. Well, the buyer who held that 22B in place does still have to try to sell their home for the remaining days of their contingency period. That contingency survives. So bullet point A is a situation where a buyer gets under contract and then falls out of contract. That contingency period is reinstated until the end of that timeline for 22B. So during that whole time, the buyer has to do everything they can to try to sell that home. Now, like I said, if it fails to close and we go beyond that, so we have got under contract and we went under contract on day 20, and then through no fault of the buyer who's trying to sell their house to buy another house, their buyer can't close. That contingency protection is still there to protect buyer, that seller who is also a buyer trying to buy with the 22B. It is a contingency protection for the sale of their home. So if their home does not sell, they are protected. Now, if the sale of the buyer's property fails to close after the expiration, then the buyer can waive the contingency if they choose, or they could not. If they waive, remember waiving and removing the contingency, not satisfying it, right? And the waiver by buyer with new construction, that's kind of its own beast. So if the buyer has, if at the time of the buyer's waiver, a certificate of occupancy has not been issued, then the buyer is going to have a closing date based on the date of certificate of occupancy. So that's one that can kind of shift along the timelines with new construction. Now, the closing date. The closing date is going to be 3 days after the home that went under contract to satisfy the 22B closes. It will automatically be 3 days. There's no need to write a closing modification form, a closing extension. That is when the closing date is, which means that when an offer is accepted, we need to make sure we are communicating that to that seller, because we now have a closing date and everybody needs to be on notice for that. So when you're doing a 22B offer, because you have not gotten under contract for that second sale, we don't know when the closing date is going to be. This is the only situation where it is acceptable to write C22B or to be determined when it comes to a closing date, because we will in fact have one once we get that second sale under contract. So that second sale, who can bump another offer? If you have a contingent offer and another offer comes in, what kind of offer can you accept to get that one out of the way? Well, a seller can accept any offer they choose. So how are we going to advise our seller on how to accept an offer that can bump someone out of the way? We'll talk about that in a second. But the form we're going to look at with this, if we have a second buyer come in, is Form 39. It gives us a lot of options on how we can accept the second offer. We do not want to make them a backup offer, because that is not what they are. If we are using them to bump another offer out of the way, then they are the second buyer, not a backup buyer. Do not use backup buyer and second buyer addendum interchangeably. They have completely different implications. Second buyer addendum. Think of this as there is a contingent sale already in place. The second buyer is going to be the buyer that we use to bump that buyer out of the way from their contingent sale. Okay, so we are going to add in the seller, who is the seller for the purchase and sale agreement we're in. This date is going to be the date that the second buyer's offer is going to refer to. So the upper information is going to refer to the contract between the second buyer and the seller. Obviously, the address is still going to be the address. When we fill out the subject property subject to prior contingent sale, we want to reference the buyer who is currently in position number 1 as the buyer who is being bumped out of the way. And we want to reference that sale again when we fill out line 8 with the buyer's property date. Now, in order to bump it out of the way, is it a good idea for your seller to go in with a second buyer, a bumping buyer who has several contingencies that maybe your first buyer doesn't have anymore? It's probably a smart idea, and I would highly recommend looking at paragraph 2 and deciding if there are any contingencies that you're going to require the second buyer remove before you start bumping the first buyer out of the way. You don't want to necessarily get through this bump notice, kick first buyer out. First buyer says, "Oh, sorry, it hasn't sold. I'll back out. Thanks. I'll take my earnest money back," only to find out that buyer number 2 that you used to bump them out of the way is going to get out on the septic or on the Form 17, or maybe a feasibility contingency. So buyer number 2, the bumping buyer, the buyer who is kicking first one out of the way, you may want to require them to remove several contingencies, if not all contingencies, before you are going to serve the bump notice to the first buyer. Remember, we are working on behalf of our sellers, doing what is best for them. So this one needs to be carefully looked at. The bump notice, this is the response that the second buyer has, the timing. With our bump notice, the second buyer, as soon as that buyer fulfills the contingency requirements back in the previous paragraph, we want a date on how quickly we can use the bump notice now. So going back to the previous slide, we want that buyer to waive Form 17, and we want the buyer to waive financing. And once they do that, within a default of 1 day, I'm going to be able to send that bump notice to the first buyer. This is something that should be very, very short timing, because remember, we may be faced with a default of 5 days for that other buyer to respond. So this is how quickly we can get the notice over to that first buyer and get them out of the way. When it comes to computation of time, all timelines that are within a second purchase and sale agreement are going to start at the mutual acceptance of the second purchase and sale agreement. Signing the backup addendum, second buyer addendum. Look at me accidentally doing that. So signing this second buyer addendum does not put into motion timelines for earnest money, for financing, for anything other than what's listed on these requirements right here. So when we're coming up to calculation and computation of time, we are not going to start timelines until that first buyer sale has been terminated. So we're not going to worry about earnest money until that first buyer who was bumped out of the way has confirmed, in fact, they are now out of the sale and this buyer has taken over that buyer position. And to leave you with a few thoughts, when you're talking about contingencies, we want to make sure that we are not using a 22EF and a 22B to disclose the same funds. If you have a sale that needs to be sold in order to purchase another one and you're using a 22B, it is not necessary that you also claim that on a 22EF. Think about this in the way that we think about a financing contingency and a 22EF. We're not going to disclose that there's a loan on the EF as well as a financing contingency. So just pick one or the other. And remember, choosing one with a contingency does have consequences, and using a 22EF with no protections are going to have their own consequences too. Keep in mind, consent is needed for any change in a closing date after mutual acceptance. Once you've gone under contract and once you have a closing date established, if that closing date needs to change, you need permission from everybody in order to do that. The buyer whose buyer wants to change the closing date needs permission from the buyer's seller. Consent is required for a 22B buyer to accept an offer with another contingency or a pending offer. So if you are a 22B buyer, you need permission before you can accept 22Bs or 22Qs. Do not put your client in a situation where their contingencies or earnest money will be at risk. So remembering this when it comes to how long you have to list the property. Don't put them in a situation that is the worst consequence you possibly could. A buyer cannot terminate before the contingency time is over based on the 22B, unless that buyer has a contingency out. So the buyer can't just pull out for no reason. If the buyer has an inspection contingency, then sure, that's an inspection contingency. But there is no out with no contractual protection. A seller has complete freedom to continue to market their property until the contingency is waived or satisfied. This is including but not limited to price reductions, extra marketing, open houses. They are free to continually market their property and do what they can to get an offer accepted that they want to accept. This also means that if you're under contract for a certain price and that seller decides they want to sell it to someone else at a lesser price, then they have all the legal right to do so. And then lastly, as a listing agent, your job is to get the seller the best offer with the best terms. So keep that in mind. All right. Thank you for listening. I hope that this brought some value to your life.